I think that there is an image of the relationship of science and religion that is actually promoted to a large extent in our educational establishment, but is popular, that is simply mistaken. The image is one of a battle or a struggle between these two. Now, there are, of course, ways in which science can understand the world that religious people don't like. And there are certainly many, many ideas in many, many religious traditions that have been shown to be wrong by science. So there are all kinds of possibilities for quarrels between the two. But if we take simply the Western Christian experience and Western science, for the most part, they have been mutually supportive rather than enemies of each other. In the medieval period, the best science available was Aristotle and those who followed Aristotle. And they made significant scientific discoveries. It was not a vapid or empty science. So the church allied itself with Aristotle. And the Pope, at his establishment in the Vatican, kept some excellent scientists, often the most prestigious scientists, to help him. Now, when a brand new idea came along, and one that contradicted Aristotelian science, the Pope supported his scientists against the new science. And this is what happened with Galileo. And this is viewed as the enmity of the church to science. It is simply a matter that the church supported the most widely respected and recognized science and established science against new ideas. Now, I'm not saying that that was the right decision, but the refusal of the scientists to take seriously what Galileo was teaching was based on Aristotle's science, not on anything that one could call religion. So it was a mistake, but a very understandable mistake. I think the church may be making that mistake today in supporting established science against some new developments that are taking place. But that has nothing to do with a warfare between science and religion. Now, during most of the period, say in the 18th and early 19th century, there wasn't any conflict between what the church taught and what most Christians thought and what science taught. I happen to be a Methodist. That means that we come from John Wesley. And Wesley was not unusual at all among Christians in saying there are two revelations of God. And one of them is in a book, and the other is in nature. And he actually developed little books, little booklets to spread among his followers, which taught them the science of the time so they could appreciate nature better. Certainly nothing anti-scientific. So the whole notion of a warfare between science and religion developed around evolutionary theory, and one needs to examine that rather carefully. For a long time, not everybody in the scientific community accepted Darwin. Scientists hang on to the past just like religious people do, and Darwin was disturbing to many scientists. And some church leaders and Christians followed Darwin, and some followed the resisting scientists. And as the consensus developed within science, one will find that there was very little church teaching. And I mean that official church teaching. I'm not talking about in many, many local congregations, all kinds of things happened. So I'm not talking about that. But Darwin was never condemned in any official church matters. The opposition to Darwin centered around the dislike on the part of human beings who throughout their lives had been taught that they were different from the rest of nature. This came from it was made extreme through the philosophy of Descartes, but of course people didn't have to read philosophy in order to get it. The whole educational system was based on this. And now they're taught that they're animals, and they just will not accept that. Now, you can say that was their religion, but it was their religion confirmed by 2 centuries of science and philosophy, and not the teaching of not actually the teaching of Christianity or of Judaism or Islam. To say, yes, many of those people looked for support in the Bible, and they found that although human beings were creatures just like the rest, there was still a kind of specialness, so that the Bible could support them in thinking they were not animals. So yes, it was possible to get from the Bible an idea that is in conflict with science, and that's true in many. There are still people who think the earth is flat, because 3,000 years ago lots of people thought the earth was flat, and that's what's reflected in the scripture. But the religious leadership never objected to the idea that the earth was round. So, on the whole, religious leaders have tried to stay current with developments in science. And so to talk about an inherent conflict, the Christian community has certainly suffered through all this. It has been split. We have a segment of the church community that is fundamentalist, and this largely grew out of just these controversies. The intense assertion that the Bible is inerrant, and therefore if the Bible says this, science must not disagree with it. That's a very modern development to defend certain very strong feelings that lots of people have. So, if you mean by religion an attitude of defending what you've already got and resisting new ideas, then that is in conflict with science. But the deeper roots of Christianity and Islam are in the prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition is exactly the one that tells you to think about it, criticize it, don't accept the given. And if you want to use the word religion for this negative tendency to sacralize what you've already got and thereby defend it against new information, you can use the word religion then, but then please understand, Christianity doesn't want to be a religion. Islam doesn't want to be a religion. Buddhism doesn't want to be a religion. It's something very deep in human beings. And I think you can find that kind of religiousness also in the scientific community. That's a human characteristic. that good science and good religion can ally against.
Well, Dr. Ramanathan, a preeminent climate scientist, has worked with this Pope Francis and the two popes previous, and you have been very supportive of the Pope and his very articulate and strong leadership on issues of the environment. So if you could have a meeting with the Pope and many scientists and many world leaders, what would be your vision of our call to action?
I think that the Pope, the present Pope, did a wonderful job in Ladauto Si. And even if I might personally make a few adjustments here and there, I'm much more interested in having something we can all support than in those nuances. So I would say, okay, let's all get together and try to actualize the world that the Pope has envisioned. Now, when all of us got together, as you described, you may have noticed that what got left out was our educational system and our universities. And unfortunately, our universities and educational system have a larger role to play in the world than all of those groups that we've gotten together. So I would say our first task is to change our schooling system and get our schools to actually take responsibility for preparing people for a different world than the present capitalist one.
Well, I know in Michael Moore's new movie, he talks about the educational system in Finland and how great it is. And part of what they're doing, we did originally here in the United States. They talk about how many of these educational ideas that are so successful there began here, but we have somehow left them out of our culture. But so much of what makes for good education is giving children freedom to play and to really emphasize feeling and relationships, and that this is where a deeper sense of purpose and meaning can be developed in children. Can you talk more about
Well, I agree with you. I have become particularly intense in my feelings against the present educational system in observing what it does in East Asia. It's bad enough in the United States, but it's worse there. And I keep telling the Chinese, you cannot build a socialist society on a capitalist educational system. What the educational system teaches is that the important thing is to learn a great many facts. It doesn't matter whether you learn anything about what's good and bad. You just have to know facts that you can put down on an exam. And the very important thing is that you do better than the kid next door.
That's right, competition.
Individualism and competition are what the schooling system, I hate to even call it education,
Yes, it's not, right.
what the schooling system primarily communicates. And I think you're right that the Finns have shown you don't have to do that. You can actually create a climate in schools in which children learn that they can accomplish more by working together than by competing with each other. And you can create a context in which learning, which is inherently a pleasant experience,
joyful even,
a joyful experience, is the way children develop. So I'm convinced that we could greatly improve our educational system, and that the products of that educational system would be much more open to making the changes that we need in society. However, I would like one step further. I would like for the Finnish educational system to say, now today, in this world, we have a need that those who taught us about what children need did not know. That is, we live in a world that is heading for destruction. And the educational system should take that very much into account and actually ask the question, how can we help our children to learn how to save the planet or the living system of the planet? So if we can get everybody to use the Finnish system and add this or reshape it in terms of the needs of humanity as a whole, then this great gathering of religious and scientific leaders would be able to make a huge difference. Without that, not much hope. So I don't think today there's really any problem in getting scientific and religious leaders together. So far as I know, when the Pope asked for scientists to help, scientists were quite willing. But the scientists who are quite willing to help when the church asks them to are not doing anything obviously effective, even though they're very influential in the schooling system. They're not using their influence to change the schools. So that's what I would particularly hope might come out of our meeting.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm happy to share that we have made a special invitation to young people to this event with you and Dr. Ramanathan. And we are calling it an intergenerational event and celebration. They are making puppets of creatures, and they will be offering music to us. And they will be, of course, joining us at the Sikh dinner. So we are trying to model this in our time with you. As an elder who has great wisdom, what, if you could speak to all of them as young people, what would your message to them be?
Well, my message would be one of sympathy, that they're being subjected to socialization that does not prepare them for the urgent needs. Occasionally, there are opportunities when young people can actually give leadership. And it may be that if young people would complain, as they did in the 60s, and a lot of the complaint was about the irrelevance of what was being done. And that irrelevance has gotten worse. In fact, I think it's not just irrelevance, it's actually communicating the wrong things, the things that make it difficult to make the change. But I would be delighted. And we do have a wonderful example in Florida where the students really took the leadership in a very mature and responsible way. So if students across the country could say, we've had it. We don't want a schooling system that guides us away from the changes that we need. That might be our best hope.
Now, these students in Florida did this at a time when they had great grief and trauma. And as you have projected, the suffering that we are going to be experiencing with climate change and all of the ramifications are horrific. How can elders show leadership to care for everyone in this time of crisis?
Well, elders in our society have a freedom and opportunity that no large segment of society has ever had before. I would not say that thus far there's been any remarkable use of that opportunity, but after we leave our jobs, our profession, we are paid to do whatever we want to do. And if we say things that most of the employers would not have liked for us to say, there's not much that can be done about it. They have to be pretty bad before the police can get to us. So I would like to see large segments of the elder population organized to express their freedom and say, now the most important issues we face are the ones that the dominant forces in our society are trying to keep us from looking at seriously. We're not anywhere close to that, but it could happen.
Well, I've shared with you, I'm 61, I'm a new grandmother, and one of the most important moments in Seizing an Alternative, the very profound conference that you put on, was when Bill McKibben made an invitation for all elders to be ready to take to the streets and to get arrested because young family parents are unable to do that. Yeah. So how do we organize in order to stand at the head of this procession of needed social outrage?
It's a good question. I have done almost nothing to specifically focus upon this segment of society. Very recently, I've been talking about it a little bit, but between beginning to talk and anything happening, the group I have been talking to earlier this week is retired ministers and their spouses. And that group could organize. It is organized. They do meet, but of course, just for social and sentimental purposes, which is fine. Social and sentimental purposes build community, essential. But it would be possible for groups like that, and of course there are many organizations of retired people, to be persuaded that the world needs their talents urgently, and it's fine for them to take a vacation, but not a 30-year vacation. Give themselves a little travel and fun, but please think of what the world needs. Use your freedom to help save it. It's possible.
You are a major interpreter of Whitehead. Will you share his worldview about an organic way of viewing the world that is the kind of worldview that we need in this time of catastrophe?
Well, of course, most people don't think philosophy has anything to do with practicality and the world, but they all have a philosophical position. And if they don't think it's important, then they don't subject it to criticism. And they think in whatever way their culture persuades them to think. When we talked about the Darwin, I think that Darwin is an immensely important, or symbol of an immensely important development. Prior to Darwin, almost everybody, scientists just as much as religious people, divided everything into two different worlds. And nature is out there, and nature is to be understood mechanistically. Very few people were protesting that. Okay. Now, the human soul, that's an entirely different matter. Okay. Now, Darwin said, no, we can't do that. Well, if human beings are part of nature, then there are two possible interpretations. One of them is, if human beings are part of nature, they are part of the machine. And our purposes have no role in the world. What we think and feel is not important. Everything is simply determined. And the consequence is nihilism. The other option is to say, we know that we do have purposes and values, and that these purposes and values are shaping what happens in the world. And if we have them and we're part of nature, then animals probably have them too. and you begin to think of nature as a living thing. And there was a generation in which these two options existed side by side. I think that the writers on the side of changing our view of the natural world were better than the others, but the deep habits of scientists resisted change. So science remained allied to the mechanistic worldview, and when scientists then took on the study of human beings, they used the same methods, same assumptions they had already been using. Well, among the group that was proposing to change were scientists. So I was talking about the majority of the practicing scientists teaching in universities. Henri Bergson was one of the most influential of these people, and he was a biologist. William James was a psychologist. John Dewey was an educational thinker and sociologist. Alfred North Whitehead was a mathematician and physicist. And I think that as a group, they still point in the right direction. Among them, simply by the nature of the way in which the world operates, it's easier and works better to go to biology from physics than to try to go from biology to physics. That's right. So, in my opinion, Whitehead provides us, really, I would even say by far, the most radical, that is, rooted, fundamental, alternative way of thinking that can also shape what all the others are saying and inform or support. It's not a battle between them. So I would say that Whitehead does, if we are looking for a way of making a fundamental change in the way we understand things, Whitehead offers it to us. And that doesn't mean we don't need all the others. It means we need a lot of other things. But Whitehead's contribution is the most fundamental and essential. And ironically, Whitehead's thought, even though his thinking took place before the development of quantum thought, it fits it. And it's just too bad that scientists are not willing to pay any attention.
So you have done a tremendous amount of work and have been very helpful and influential in China and bringing Whiteheadian ideas to China. Can you tell us about your work there?
Well, this is an utterly astounding development. I would have never dreamed before it happened that the Chinese communists would be more interested in what I have to say than American Christians. After the collapse of the Maoist efforts to really bring Marxism to China, that would mean to do away with class distinctions in China. There was a reaction, and Marx no longer gave a real spiritual guide or direction to what happened. The Communist Party remained in power. And the Communist Party is different because of its Marxist roots. But it was sort of like Christianity in Scandinavia. Still officially, Sweden is a Lutheran country, But if you ask
Yes.
how many people are informed by what Luther said, well, it wouldn't be quite that extreme. But in any case, China had almost no ideology except modernization. And the intellectuals of China did not like for China to commit itself wholly to modernization at a time when the intellectuals of Europe were devoting themselves to a critique of modernity. So a number of them were postmodernists, but the French postmodernism has almost nothing to say about the natural world and almost no practical response to such issues as smog. And the main problems, obvious problems, with modernity in China was what it was doing to the natural world and to the air that people wanted to breathe and so forth and so on. Now, in the United States, we followers of Whitehead had been calling ourselves postmodernists because Whitehead wrote a book on science and the modern world and showed how the modern world had exhausted itself and made way for something else. But Whitehead made practical proposals of what that meant positively. And so we called ourselves, after the French took over the label of postmodernism, we called ourselves constructive postmodernists. Well, that move, we'd had nothing, no thought about China. That was, but it happened that the idea of being postmodernists in a constructive way with practical advice about how China could develop, that struck a nerve in China of a totally different sort from any response we've ever had anywhere else. So, constructive postmodernism, I think in China today, if you say postmodern, they think of constructive postmodernism. And this is both at, what shall I say, a general university kind of level, and also in the highest levels of government, that this is taken seriously. The one concrete change that I am most happy with and most proud of is that China was planning to imitate the United States in industrializing agriculture. And that means a more thorough depopulation of the countryside, continuing huge concentrations on the huge cities of China. And China has reversed that policy and is making strong public statements about developing the rural China rather than and bulldozing it down, as we might say. In the past few decades, what scientists keep discovering are things like what are called constants, that in this universe there are certain relationships among things for which no reason can be given, so they're chance. There has to be some relationship, and so this is the one that happens to be. But in case after case after case, these things, if they were just a little different, life could not have emerged on them anywhere in the universe. Now that's exactly the kind of argument from design, design was the word that was used, that was on the defensive for a century. Now, all sorts of evidence for design has been discovered. But the atheism is so deeply entrenched that rather than take it as an evidence that there is a purpose, a design, scientists now, many of them, would prefer to say, oh, well, there must be 1 trillion universes, and we just happen to be in the one that has this particular pattern. From my point of view, that just that's not rational in any kind of neutral sense, but the commitment to an atheistic metaphysics is so strong. From my point of view, the scientists are the religious folks. I mean, the ones who dominate the universities. I'm not talking about every individual scientist.
Yes.
Oh. There are scientists who seized on this discovery and said that we have they call it an anthropic principle. It's not really that there's any focus on human life, it's just life in general. So anthropic is a poor name for it. So of course there are some scientists who recognize that belief in God is now the more plausible view. But you don't dare say that in a university.
And there have been people who have been definitely excommunicated, Reverend Sheldrake and scientists like that.
That's right.
What do you say to people who have been excommunicated by these dominant worldviews when they are, have been shunned? What would be your advice to them?
Well, of course, I know two of them. One of them in economics and one in biology. Yeah, Rupert. I don't know Rupert Sheldrake nearly as well. I think they've both made great careers, in spite of having been completely excommunicated. And so I just admire their achievements. And in the case of Daly, there are now, you occasionally find an academic department of economics in which ecological economics is mentioned. So that a slight crack, not much. But there are associations of ecological economy. In other words, he has brought into being a movement of economic thought that, even though it is still excluded from the people who control what happens in universities, it is recognized, and sometimes, occasionally, politicians will not only listen to the advice of the standard brand economists, but also want to get the advice of someone else. I don't know of anything quite like that happening yet with Rupert Sheldrake, but he certainly has a following in the broader public. And if that following continues, I'm afraid many people will say, oh, he's religious, and therefore this is the battle of religion versus science. But of course he just appeals to the evidence, and that ought to be recognized as science.
Well, he happens to be a Christian, and I know...
Both of them are.
Yes.
Both of them are serious Christians.
And so is Bill McKibben, who's a major
right.
ecologic leader, and certainly you are. Will you talk about your relationship with Jesus? You've recently written a beautiful book, Jesus, Abba, and that your relationship with Jesus has been very important to you. Will you share with us about that?
Well, the book that you refer to is about Jesus Abba. That is, in his culture, the word for father was Abba. And there are other cultures in which baby talk is used, but usually there's another word that people grow out of the baby talk. It happens, I call my father Papa. And of course, Papa and Abba. the same. And I think that calling God Abba, in Jesus' case, and probably in other people in his community, I imagine there's some continuity between the way Jesus thought and the way his mother thought, for example. But I imagine other people, some of the neighbors may have thought in similar ways. To think of God as Abba is very different from thinking of God as King. And unfortunately, as Jesus' message moved into the Greek world, although this use of family language rather than political language went with it, that it did not lose. It got translated into pater, and in a patriarchal culture, pater is halfway between Abba and King. So that in the course of time, even though the language of father is still very important in Christianity, sovereignty became, Calvinism is the most extreme case, but other Christians didn't criticize Calvin for emphasizing sovereignty. It becomes part of it. But long before that, the translator of the New Testament, well, of the Bible, into Latin, chose to introduce the language of omnipotence. Well, when you get
all-powerful
raw language, an omnipotent Abba is kind of strange talk. I mean, of course, the baby would feel that the papa is very powerful, but the mama is too, I mean, it's not.
It's not a relationship based on fear of power over and punishment.
Exactly. Right. So I think that much of the widespread reaction against God talk in our society is a reaction against a God very different from Jesus, Abba, and one that is properly rejected.
Yes.
So it would be wonderful if people would ask once again, is it possible that Jesus really did reveal God to us? And nobody calls Jesus omnipotent or king. That's not the impression he made on people. It's still not the impression that comes through. The fact that God could shape things in ways that made life possible is, I think God can also works today in shaping our lives in ways that bring good things into being, but certainly doesn't control your life and make your decisions for you.
Well, that rejection of a patriarchal God is something that I know you have supported many women and scholars in exploring. Can you talk about your relationship with many wonderful women that you taught and the whole gender revolution and how feminism has really, and ecofeminism particularly, has really vitalized religion, Christianity, and the academy?
Well, I think you've already said much of what needs to be said on the subject, and I appreciate the question. Gender issues were not something I came to on my own at all. It's always hard when you look back and say, why didn't I notice? But my own experience of women was of strong leaders. And it didn't occur to me that women were being suppressed and oppressed until...
Because they weren't in your family.
They went in my family, but they also on the mission field.
Yes.
The women who went to Japan and became presidents of universities there, their only authorities were women back in the United States who were ready to...
Yeah.
You understand?
Yes, I do. They were empowered. Yes.
They were empowered, and there were some very strong women. I would say the selection process made the women I knew, the Western women I knew, on the whole, stronger than the Western men that I knew. So it took me a while to understand what the gender issues were. But as I understood, I certainly have appreciated. And I think, although I like Abba very much, Mama might be better. On the other hand, I didn't try to push that. But the fact that for some centuries Mary was really more the object of worship. I mean, there are a lot more churches named after Mary in one way or another, is an indication of how many Christians longed for the maternal. And that was probably closer to Abba than what was happening when people talked about God the Father.
Yes. Well, I've always said you are the best ambassador for Christianity of anyone I've ever met. And you are unique among academics and scholars and geniuses in your kindness and accessibility to others. I remember how we met is you had a Ask Dr. Cobb column
Oh, yes.
at the Center of Process Studies, and I wrote to you and you wrote back to me.
Mhm.
So can you just talk about your uniqueness and your kindness and how we can somehow people I know are just infused with this by being in your presence, but tell us about your upbringing and how you have come to your very countercultural ways of being kind and loving and accessible, inclusive, generous, in a world and in a profession that tends to be competitive and mean-spirited.
I don't know whether I can take that on. I think I selected excellent parents. When people ask me my secret for being healthy and active in old age, and say, well, how do you do that? I say, I selected excellent parents. And many people could say this, but of course I experienced unconditional love. It didn't occur to me there was anything unusual about that. But I believe that is immensely important. If you never experience unconditional love, then to be told that God loves you unconditionally, you may not be able to believe it. And so I have understood God as, I wouldn't always use that language, but as unconditionally loving me and unconditionally loving everyone from young childhood. I didn't have to think my way to it. And I'm just very grateful for that. And I think if one experiences from parents and from God unconditional love, that it is not odd or strange if that is an important part of the way one understands everything else. So I will give that the credit for whatever I have accomplished along the lines you described.